Good morning. My name is Ryan Evans, and I'm the Executive Director at Chambers for Innovation in Clean Energy. Chambers for Innovation in Clean Energy is an organization that works with chambers of commerce and economic development organizations to advance the clean energy economy. We focus on promoting good clean energy policy and programs and look to amplify the incredible associations and the smallest, those in red and blue states, as well as urban and rural communities. Thank you for joining us and our co-hosts, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, the multi-billion-dollar Colorado renewable energy industry and its benefits for local communities. For years now, Colorado has been a leader in advancing clean energy and has embraced the economic benefits that come with renewable energy projects and the marketing benefits in terms of recruiting companies and talent for economic development purposes. It is a state that is known for its outdoors and has sought to not only protect that experience, but benefit from it as well. You will hear today how much investment has come from renewable energy projects and what is yet to come. You'll learn how renewable energy is benefiting the state economy, but more importantly, perhaps, how projects are benefiting local rural communities, in particular, those that struggle to attract investment and jobs to their regions. And you'll hear how renewable energy is helping Colorado companies improve their operations and save money. We look forward to the continued ability to tell these stories for years to come. I will leave it to our speakers, however, to provide their insight and to better tell the positive impact that renewable energy is having in Colorado. We have several people scheduled to speak with you today, so I want to wrap up my time as quickly as possible so that you can actually hear from them. In our meeting today, we will hear from our featured presenters, Mike Kruger, President and CEO of the Colorado Solar and Storage Association, Greg Brophy, State Director at the Western Way, and Alyssa Edwards, Vice President of Environmental Affairs and Government Relations for Lightsource BP. You will also hear from Troy McHugh, Executive Director at the Lincoln County Economic Development Corporation, and Kathy Shull, Executive Director at Pro15. Both of whom will share a little bit about their connection to this topic and help introduce our speakers. Following our speakers, we will host a Q&A session at the very end for all of you to ask questions. I would like to say a special thank you as well to Jessica Bergman from CICE, who is our webinar host and coordinating our presentations today. And Jess, if you could back up to the co-host screen, today's webinar is co-hosted by several great organizations that spend each of their days looking to improve the business environment in their region, as well as the state and local economies. Those co-hosts are Pro15, Lincoln County Economic Development Corporation, the Western Way, Logan County Economic Development Corporation, Action 22, the Denver Metro Chamber of Commerce, Vail Valley Partnership, the Colorado Solar and Storage Association, and the Clean Energy Business Network. Thank you to all for the work that you do on behalf of Colorado and your communities. And now just a brief housekeeping message to share before I turn the time over to Mike. Approximately 70 people have joined today's webinar. And as attendees, presenters will not hear or see you. In order to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature on your Zoom menu. Presenters and the host will see your questions, but other attendees will not. We will be monitoring that section for questions and will address them at the end of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded for possible use in the future. I would now like to introduce our first presenter and co-host, Mike Kruger, President and CEO of the Colorado Solar and Storage Association, a position he has held since October of 2018. Previously, Mike was the Director of Communications for the Smart Electric Power Alliance, SEPA, in Washington, D.C. He oversaw all public communications for the organization, including public speaking engagements, research reports, and the annual SEPA Power Players Awards program. Prior to joining SEPA, Mike was the Deputy Director of Communications for the U.S. Department of Commerce under the Obama administration. He also served on the communications staff for the U.S. House of Representatives Education and Labor Committee. Kruger earned a Master of Arts in Education and Social Justice from the University of London and a Bachelor of Arts in History from Western Washington University. When he's not explaining the wonders of the electric grid, you can find him watching baseball. Mike is someone I've known for several years and was actually at one of the first public meetings where he was announced as the CEO of COSA. He's a friend and someone who I have respected in how much knowledge and passion he brings to the solar industry. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Since it's a long, cold winter and there's no baseball, it's a real pleasure to be here explaining the wonders of the power grid. You know, Colorado has had an amazing transformation towards clean energy, and I just want to give you a quick rundown. I'd like you to roll back in your mind a whopping 2 years to December of 2018, right after the election of Governor Polis. Xcel, the largest utility here in the state, declared that they were going to reach 100% clean energy by 2050. Not to be outdone, the next month, Platte River Power Authority, which provides power to 4 municipal utilities here in the state, they declared in January of 2019 that they were going to get to 100% by 2035. And both of these utilities said, we're definitely going to do it. We have no idea how we're going to get there. Fast forward just a simple year to the beginning of this year, which I know feels like a decade ago. But in January of 2020, Tri-State Generation and Transmission, which feeds 17 of our 24 co-ops here in the state, they declared that they were going 100% by 2040. Again, they had no idea how they were going to do it, but they were definitely going to get there, which was a giant turnaround for them, because not 5 years ago, their former CEO used to say, look, electrons are electrons, and no one knows if it's a coal electron or a renewable electron, in a way to, you know, definitely downplay the value of renewables in his mind. Here, you know, just this year, now 5 years after that very kind of strong stance against renewables, they're saying they're going to 100% by 2040. And just this week, so we are just 2 years on from that first initial declaration, just this week, Holy Cross Energy, a distribution cooperative in the middle of our wonderful state, they declared they're going 100% by 2030. But they didn't just say, hey, this is a goal. They have a clear roadmap and path. They know how they're going to get there from here. Huge, huge advances. So we are moving rapidly. I mean, the electric power sector really didn't change much from about 1900 to 2000. A little bit of change with some wind and solar at the beginning of this century, but massive change, unlike anything we've seen in the electric power sector since probably the electrification of rural co-ops in the 1930s. So what does that mean for Colorado? We build it as multi-billion dollars. Well, what are we talking about? Well, Colorado, when we're using our most energy, we're about 15 gigawatts, right? That's our total peak capacity, which if you don't work in this space may not mean much for you, but to give you some sense of what 15 gigawatts is versus how much renewables we have on the system, if you take from when mankind first walked upright until January 1st of 2019, the installed capacity of renewables on Colorado's system was a little less than 2 gigawatts. So we have, say, a little more than 2 gigawatts now because we've energized some stuff this year and in late 2019. But we've got 2 and we're going to have to get to 15. So what kind of opportunity is that? Well, that's obviously 13 gigawatts. Again, sounds like a lot of energy, but how much money is that? Well, at the going rate today, when produced in large scale, we're saying in hundreds of megawatts at a time, it's about $2 a watt, give or take. So that remaining, 13 gigawatts means that there's about $26 billion of investment still to be done in the state. And in fact, we saw at the beginning of this month, not 16 days ago, Tri-State asking in their most recent electric resource plan for 2 gigawatts. One utility with one resource plan spanning the next 5 years, asking to procure, they have to get permission from the utility, Public Utility Commission, but asking to procure more or less the same amount that we've built in the existence of time. And they're not the biggest utility in the state. Xcel in Q1 of next year will probably put forth an electric resource plan that will call for 5 gigawatts. So we're looking at, in 2021, 2022, and 2023, 7-ish gigawatts, $14 billion of money, of investment available. Now, how do you get your hands on some of that money, right? As a developer, you got to be very aggressive, obviously, in your bidding, and you're going to have to build some long-term relationships with landowners and with local economic development communities. So our large scale will probably be located in rural Colorado. There's a couple of reasons for that. Primarily, that is where ample land is available and relatively inexpensive. Contrary to kind of a popular opinion, Solar doesn't go on high productive agricultural land. If a farmer can make more money raising soybeans or wheat or corn or cattle, they're going to do that. Solar ends up on the lower productive land, the dry land grazing areas, land that may be have no water rights, for example. That's where solar ends up. That land tends to have a very low value, and therefore developers that belong to the Colorado Solar and Storage Association can lease it for a relatively low amount of money, therefore be competitive when these solicitations come out to provide the lowest cost power to the state. So that's one. Another is the permitting simple? It doesn't have to be uncomplicated in that we're not asking for a free pass, but is there a clear and simple path to take your idea of a development and turn that into an actual project? Or is it a Byzantine maze of a permitting and environmental and local community engagement? If that is not wrapped up tightly, and the Lincoln County, who's after me, might speak a bit about how they improve their permitting to attract investment out there. If that's not simple, and my developer has no idea kind of where to go or how to start or how much time is going to be involved, they're probably going to choose a different county. And then finally, what kind of transmission capacity is available? So the assumption was that Eastern Colorado would attract a lot of investment and a lot of large solar because they have quite a bit of land. Permitting in most counties is relatively straightforward, and they got a lot of sun. But in Tri-State's most recent filing, they did a bunch of modeling, and it showed that the Eastern Plains is relatively crowded on the transmission wires. And they've asked for more solar to be built on the Western Slope. Again, the Western Slope doesn't have as good of solar resource, but it has space on the wires. Most important thing about electricity, right? It's hot showers and cold beers. Is the power there when you need it? It's not, doesn't do you any good if you can generate it, but you can't deliver it. So transmission, does your area, does your county have access to transmission lines, or are you open to new transmission lines? That's a whole another ball of wax, but counties that are open to attracting that new transmission will also then attract that new solar or wind investment. So what's the value, right? What's the value to attracting this? There's an initial flurry of activity. You get 6 or 9 months of workers, installing the panels and the racks and getting it energized, and they're going to spend money at the local hotels, local restaurants, etc. But really what we think here in the Solar Association, we really think the long-term value is that leaseholders get predictable payments for 20 years. So if they can take this lower value ag land, they can turn into higher value payments that help offset the commodity production prices of their other land, for example. So they have a constant flow of money. We've heard of farmers farming soybeans and the sun. And because they've got the sun to offset the highs and lows of soybeans, they're in a long-term financial position and can stay on the land. For the local communities, you get 20 or 30 years of sustainable, expected, reliable tax payments on the property tax. So you can begin to make some of those long-term investments in your community, knowing that you've got this long-term payments coming. We've seen one county, especially here in Colorado, that has been boom or bust based on the oil and gas cycle. So some years they're flush with cash, and some years, like this year, the money dries up. And so that makes it hard for long-term planning for that county on where they're going to spend their investments and spend their money. Solar and wind provide that long-term, sustainable, reliable tax payments. So you can make those investments with your community, knowing that you can pay them off and you're not going to end up having to either cut back or raise taxes. So I am super bullish on Colorado's solar future. I'm super bullish on many states. I know there's a lot of folks who aren't here from Colorado. Many states, many utilities are looking at the numbers, the pure cash numbers, and you'll hear later from BP Lightsource about how much cheaper solar and wind can be. And so we're seeing this across the country, many states saying, no, we're going to move to clean energy, not only for the environmental benefits, but also the money, the lower cost energy. So super bullish on Colorado. The future is bright. The next 10 years, we'll see that probably $23 billion of investment. And we fully expect that the competitive areas, competitive counties will then receive the vast majority of that investment. So My one message takeaway to the folks who are decision makers at the county level is, if you want to be able to obtain some of this investment, do you have pretty clear permitting, and are you open to talking about transmission within your county? Because those would be the two things that really attract developers and ultimately attract that long-term sustainable payments. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Troy McHugh from Lincoln County. I know he's going to talk a little bit about what he has done in Lincoln to attract those beautiful windmills that are there in his background. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to any questions.
Great, thank you, Mike. Yes, I'm the Executive Director for Lincoln County Economic Development Corporation. We were formed back in 2003, and that was well before we saw any of the renewable wind energy assets here in our area. Starting in 2011, which was the Cedar Point Wind Project, we have seen a steady flow of the build out of wind turbines, and now Lincoln County is home to just over 500 wind turbines for the entire area. Additionally, there's one other wind farm on the drawing board that we are waiting to see if it comes to fruition. The green energy piece for us has been very significant. We're strictly an ag county with transportation corridors and a little bit of education, healthcare, and government, like many rural counties. Once the green industry showed up, we really started to see a big shift in our tax base. And to date, green energy amounts to 42% of our local tax base, and that's huge. In fact, all the ag land only amounts for 18% of our local tax base. So it's certainly a game changer. Those landowners that have the wind turbines obviously get to enjoy those annual payments. And then, of course, sometimes the bigger challenge in that development piece, has already been mentioned, has been the development of the transmission lines. In fact, the one wind farm that is on the drawing books today in Lincoln County is trying to perfect the very last bits of those needed easements for transmission lines. So that is a capacity issue that is something that has to be addressed and continue to work through. Nonetheless, we are excited to be part of that. I really believe that the solar part on the Eastern Plains is what really represents potentially the next chapter for our green energy mix. Our wind turbines feed the grid, but I also know that there can be a mix of solar and wind in such a way that you can better optimize some of that transmission capacity. One thing I do notice is that once transmission line capacities are added to our rural county, they quickly fill up. So it seems like that might be the bottleneck in the entire scenario. Nonetheless, we're excited to be playing a part of that. I would agree that the solar assets out here and the solar potential is huge. I do believe that there's some marginal farm ground, especially in the southern end of Lincoln County, that could serve well in that solar piece without sacrificing much in terms of agriculture production. And I think that is a qualitative and quantitative process to work through to see where do they fit the best and still support a good mix of land use between agriculture and green energy production. So thanks for having me today. I'm really interested to learn more from the rest of the speakers. And because of that, I'd like to introduce our next one. He is the state director for the Western Way in Colorado. Greg, hang on just a minute here. I've got to exit my full screen from my notes. Greg is a political advocate, activist, and fourth generation family farmer from Ray. He has served 9 years in the Colorado State Senate and 3 years in the Colorado House. Greg also spent a year as the chief of staff in the U.S. House of Representatives. Greg is a frequent guest commentary on some of the Colorado media, 9 News, Channel 7, KOA, and KHOW. Greg is currently farming and consulting. Greg is especially adept at organizing rural, center-right, and activist conservatives. He and Angela have been married for 30 years. That sounds familiar. That's how long I've been married. They have 3 kids and 4 grandchildren. So welcome, Greg, and I'll let you take over.
Thank you, Troy, and it's good to be with everyone. And it's fun to hear Troy talk about what I observed personally happening in Lincoln County when I had the pleasure of representing them in the Colorado State Senate. Now I am the state director for the Western Way. The Western Way is a group of conservatives who believe that there are market-based solutions for many of our environmental challenges, and we look to forward those ideas and defend those ideas and offer solutions to environmental challenges that we all observe in the country. Next slide, please. At the Western Way, we wanted to take a look at the value of renewables, primarily to Eastern Colorado in terms of jobs, net investment, taxes, and royalty payments to farmers and ranchers. Next slide, please. So we partnered with Pro 15 and Action 22 to study the economic benefits out in Eastern Colorado. But I think to fully understand what's the dynamism, what's changed in Eastern Colorado since I was actually in the legislature myself. Next slide, please. We first need to look at the study that we did in 2016, which we also partnered with Pro 15 on. Next slide, please. What we found in 2016, as far as the number of jobs go, most of them were in manufacturing, 4,252 jobs. That number is a little small on the bottom. It's 4,252 jobs. About 70% of them are in manufacturing. So those jobs are, of course, located where the factories are, Pueblo, up in Weld County area. But there's also a lot of jobs in operations and maintenance. About 4% of the total 4,200 jobs are in operations and maintenance for wind, and about 1% at the time in 2016 were in solar. And that's a big deal. It takes, 20 jobs in Lincoln County is like the functional equivalent of 200,000 jobs in the Front Range of Colorado. So we really noticed that. And let's take a look at the next slide, please, where we see the total projects that were in place up and running in 2016. There were 16 of them. The first one built in 2000 up in Logan County, and then all the way to the 16th one up and running in 2016. And then let's look at the next slide to see what this is worth in money to people in Eastern Colorado. Now the royalty payments are estimated because that's a private contract. You don't know exactly what people are being paid. It's often estimated at between $5,000 and $7,000 per year per megawatt. So 7.8 million estimated in royalty payments to farmers and ranchers in Eastern Colorado, and about 7.1 million in property taxes. And again, this was in 2016. So let's go to the next slide, please. We decided we would update the 2016 study, but we decided to look ahead to 2024, assuming that all of the projects that were currently up and running or permitted in 2020 would be up and running and fully functional by 2024. So then we take a look at the total number of projects on the next slide. Remember, we had 16 projects up and running in 2016. By 2024, we will have 40 projects up and running out in the Eastern Plains of Colorado. That's a pretty big increase in 8 years, especially when you consider that they all had to be permitted and constructed in substantially less time than that. So let's take a look at the next slide and see that the jobs went from, if you remember, it was 4,200. Now the jobs are up to 6,300. Still the bulk of them in manufacturing, at about 63% in manufacturing. The operations and maintenance continues to go up and provide jobs out in Eastern Colorado. Now the O&M jobs, depends on who you ask, and it depends a little bit upon the size of the wind farm. If it's a 60 megawatt wind farm versus a 500 megawatt wind farm. But the rule of thumb is that there's one permanent local full-time job for every 15 to 20 towers that you see that are part of a project out in Eastern Colorado. So again, now you look at I think Troy said there's something like 500 towers in Lincoln County, think about how many jobs that is located in Lincoln County when you're talking about a county with not that many people. Let's go to the next slide, please. And if you remember, back in the 2016, we had an estimated 7.8 million a year in payments to landowners. And now we're up to 15.2 as the estimated payment. And let's talk a little bit about how important that is. One of my farmer friends in Kit Carson County, which I'm going to be talking about here in a minute, the county broadly, I called him when I drove past his farm. He's clear on the eastern edge of the county, and I hadn't been to his farm since 2012. So when I drove past his farm in, I think, early 2016 to go to a basketball tournament out in Kansas, I saw that there were wind towers there. So I called him up and I said, "Did you get some wind towers?" He goes, "Yes, I did." And I said, "Well, good for you." He said, "You know, Greg, 2015 was a tough year on our farm. And for those of you who aren't involved directly in farming, you should know that 2015 was the third year in a commodity price crash, especially for the grains, where we saw grain prices fall at the fastest rate over a 3-year period that they had fallen since the Great Depression. So it was bad. It was really bad. It was even worse than the 80s. And my friend told me that if it hadn't been for the revenue from the wind towers on his farm, he would have made no money at all in the year 2015. So can you imagine no salary at all for a whole year, and you just have to suck it up and draw on your savings and try to get by? But he was fortunate in that he had payments from, I think, 4 wind towers on his farm, and that ended up representing the entire amount of money that he made in that year. And then take a look at the property tax. Total property tax take is up from 7.1 million in 2016 to 23.1 million total in 2024. This is when the things that are currently being built are up and fully functional. So let's go to the next slide, please. And what I want to highlight on this slide, and I know it's a little fuzzy, but I know the numbers off the top of my head, and I'll page back to the next ones as I need to. Take a look at Kit Carson County, which I have highlighted there. Back in 2016, Kit Carson County, that all of the districts in the county generated $632,000 a year in taxes from the wind farms, $340,000 a year that went to the county's general fund. When you look at what they're going to receive as a county in 2024, the total revenue to the county in property taxes, all districts, all in, goes up to 3.7, almost $3.8 million from 632. To the county general fund, almost $2 million a year to their county general fund. And I know Troy said that in Lincoln County, the wind energy is primarily wind in Lincoln County, represents 42% of their total county general fund. And it's going to be pretty close to that also in Kit Carson County. And as a recovering elected official, I got to tell you, if you have the opportunity to fund things for your constituents, maintaining the roads and providing the services that they want and deserve, primarily paid for by people who live outside of your county, which is what we have when you're selling electricity to people outside of the county primarily. That is a politician's dream, and it's a dream come true. And we're seeing that writ large across the county. And I'm really excited to hear Mike tell us that there is many, many, many more projects potentially available in the next few years coming primarily to Eastern Colorado. Very excited about the prospect of co-locating solar in and around these wind farms to take advantage of the transmission that's already in place. Next slide, please. So I am Greg Brophy, and there's all my contact information. If you want to take a quick screen capture, you can do that. I'm the state director now for the Western Way, and I have my cell phone number and my email address on there. And if you want to check me out on Twitter, that's on there too. And the Western Way's also on Twitter. We just shared a little story today, an op-ed that I wrote that is out in the Sterling Journal Advocate, talking about the value of renewable energy in Eastern Colorado. So I get now to introduce one of my dear friends, a lady who I have known for, golly, 20 years now, Kathy. back when she was at the Fort Morgan Chamber. Kathy Shull is the executive director of Pro 15, a group that advocates for the interests, the general interests of 15 counties in Eastern Colorado. Kathy is an absolute star. She knows everybody in Eastern Colorado, all the politicians, and she is a great advocate and a great voice for rural Colorado. Kathy, take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Greg. Greg and I have had a long relationship, and someday ask him how we started the original Bike the Eastern Plains before Governor Hickenlooper thought of it. Pro 15 is a organization in northeastern Colorado, and we advocate for a 15 county region. But we look at legislation, policies, and procedures and rules for the economic benefit of our region. We look at them on a state level and on a federal level, and we're either for or against something depending on how it affects the economy of our region. We are very much rural focused as we look at things, though we have several large suburban counties that have large rural landmass, and we have a lot of similar thoughts and ideas on the areas that they have a lot of land, and then they have a lot of people at the legislature, and it makes for a great partnership as we advocate at the state level. When Pro 15 started 20 years ago, we would have never thought about renewable energy. We were totally oil and gas and agriculture, and it has quickly changed over the years as we have seen the benefit of renewables and what it can do to the economy of our region. It is my pleasure now to introduce our final speaker this morning. Alyssa Edwards is the Vice President of Environmental Affairs and Government Relations. She is a leader in environmental policy for the renewable energy sector with over 14 years of experience managing environmental and regulatory compliance for grid scale wind and solar energy projects. Her expert knowledge of wildlife regulations, permitting, and siting issues that impact renewable energy development, construction, and operations have helped advance more than 6 gigawatts of executed projects. Elisa has highly established government agency and stakeholder relationships regionally and nationally, and has served on a number of advisory councils, committees, and boards. Prior to joining LightSource BP, Alyssa was the environmental director at EDF Renewables, implementing a portfolio-wide permitting and compliance strategy. Alyssa received her bachelor's degree in environmental science from Lehigh University and a master's degree in environmental policy, planning, and regulation from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And take it away, Alyssa.
Well, Kathy, thank you so much. And hi, everyone. It's really good to be here and join this conference virtually. Hopefully next time we'll all be in person. Today, I'd like to talk about solar development and sustainability. Next slide, please. So as Kathy mentioned, I work for LightSource BP. I'll just spend 10 seconds talking about LightSource BP if you don't know us. As the name implies, we're a 50-50 JV. LightSource became that JV with BP in 2018. LightSource, prior to that, has been around for about a decade. It's the largest solar developer in Europe. And throughout the US, we have about 8,000 megawatts in our pipeline, and we're doing some really exciting stuff in Colorado, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Next slide, please. Okay, so first, I'm going to talk about siting and permitting, and then I'll get into the sustainability topic. Next slide, please. So first, I just want to take a couple minutes and sort of level set on siting and permitting. I think, everybody knows this. This is kind of the obvious, but thoughtful and deliberate siting, the importance of it. I mean, it just can't be overstated, and something that we take very seriously at Lightsource BP, but I know also throughout the industry. And, the goal for every project is to achieve low conflict siting, we like to say. So using best available GIS data and other desktop data is really the key to early siting when a site is identified. So the list shown here, those are aspects that we regularly check off for siting. And, we use data sets around these topics, basically to create best management practices to support this, concept of low conflict siting. And I think, industry best practices go a long way. I think we all know this in building stakeholder support, but also accountability for the industry. So we take this data, right, the data on all these different topics, and then we can figure out how to utilize previously disturbed areas, create avoidance and setbacks from sensitive or otherwise valuable habitat such as wetlands. It's pretty important to stay away from, dense residences and homes. We even check in with the Federal Aviation Administration to make sure that there's no issues relating to aircraft or airspace, et cetera. So, a lot of data and thought goes into site selection. Next slide, please. So I won't want to bore everybody by going through all of this, but these are typical solar studies and permits, specific to Colorado. On the left-hand side, you can see environmental studies. These sometimes, depending on the jurisdiction, are required, but I would say all of the studies that are listed here are really just, again, industry best practices. They're site-specific on-the-ground surveys that we need to do to understand, what is the landscape that we're dealing with and how can we avoid and minimize to the greatest extent possible. And then, of course, solar facilities, they don't just sort of jump up out of nowhere. They are regulated. Everybody knows Colorado has a 1041 permit, which allows the local jurisdictions to take over the permitting. Some projects may need state or federal species permits. I mean, certainly, I don't think there's a developer out there that that's never the goal. You always want to avoid and minimize impacts, so you don't need that. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, of course, that regulates any fill into jurisdictional waters. And then, of course, any earth disturbance is subject to NIPDs and stormwater discharges associated with construction. Department of Transportation in Colorado will handle any roadway access or utility permits. And then, of course, there's building permits. So, when it's all said and done, when we're done with projects, we got a pretty hefty stack of environmental studies and permits and approvals that we need to get. Next slide, please. Okay, so now jumping into solar and sustainability, which is a really exciting part about my job and I talk about all the time, and it's just really emerging and really exciting to see, where the industry goes with this. Next slide, please. So this concept of long-term land management and ecosystem benefits is it's emerging, it's important. We're getting grants to study it. Universities are interested in this. And, it really starts with land regeneration. So, if you consider a solar farm, it gets put on the landscape and it basically is undisturbed for, 25, 30 years once it's constructed. The actual disturbance of a solar facility is very, very low. So the solar panels are, say 7 feet off the ground, and there's a really rich opportunity for habitat to grow underneath the solar panels. And this gives land a recovery period. So, we've talked to many people in the agricultural community that talk about the importance of the recovery period, and this increases soil quality and many times land value as well. And then the second thing I'd like to talk about, and it's emerging as a really important topic in solar, is this concept of agrivoltaics. And, as the name suggests, the combination of agriculture and solar. And many stakeholders view this as a very unique opportunity. And, like I said, we have this great opportunity for dual use strategies. We have solar panels hovering over the ground. And, the topic of ag and solar is just catching on in many levels. As I mentioned, local jurisdictions are having something to say about it, environmental groups for sure. I've talked to a number of faculty at different universities. And in my experience, even politicians are that I talk to are really interested in this concept. And we fully support it. It's a way to boost biodiversity in many cases. And it can support some really interesting and meaningful conservation. I would say right now, sheep grazing and honeybee production are probably the most common types of agrivoltaics that are being employed at solar sites. But there are other ideas out there. I've talked to many individuals about, coming up with the right crops that can grow underneath solar panels. I do think it's important to keep in mind, not to overpromise or, just sort of acknowledge that not every type of project is ideal for these types of initiatives. So it's definitely not a one size fits all approach. But, that being said, sheep grazing in particular, not only keeps the land in agricultural production, but it can also provide farmers with additional income streams. In the setups that I've seen, the grazer actually takes the contract for the vegetation management for the site, in full or in part. So, it's been a great benefit for, nourishing the soil and plantings, gives the land a recovery period, like I said, increases future soil quality, and it can be a really nice benefit for participating farmers in the community. And it is a really key initiative to building stakeholder support. And then lastly here, I'm sure many of you have heard about, the opportunity for your project to be pollinator friendly. I am learning and working with many experts in this field that it can take many forms. As one can imagine with the pollinator crisis occurring in the US, many stakeholders are, very interested in this topic. Pollinator plantings can be really expensive. And, with solar often having slim margins, the financial costs need to be considered. I'm learning that, pollinator habitat, it varies greatly in the type of species. In fact, I've been on a number of conversations this week about the right species for Colorado. But I mean, the bottom line is that any added pollinator and native plantings are beneficial to the landscape. And if solar projects have the opportunity to implement this initiative, it's definitely just a really big benefit. Next slide, please. So this is just another quick slide on co-location with solar and sheep. I usually get a lot of questions about this. There's just a couple of pictures here from some of the farmers that we work with that farm at solar facilities here on the right of your screen. And in addition to this additional revenue stream for farmers managing livestock, and a lot of times the farmers aren't necessarily the landowners, so you can really you can just dig deeper into the community and offer those connections and diversified revenue. But there's also these secondary benefits to veterinarians, equipment dealers, seed suppliers, and just general farm infrastructure suppliers, coming into communities. So that's something that, has been documented and we've seen, and, we just think is just a really cool benefit. And, just one other note here about sheep grazing, because I get a lot of questions about this, how do you sort of just let the sheep sort of roam? And actually, it's a very orchestrated process. There's a rotational plan, and the number of sheep is very well thought out. I mean, you really have to have a farmer that is experienced to manage this work. I mean, essentially, the sheep are doing the work that basically a lawnmower would do with a typical O&M plan. And of course, these projects need to be outfitted with the right provisions for sheep. So they have to have a water source. Sheep don't drink a ton of water, but they certainly need it. You need to have the right fencing. You might have to have the right gates. So, there's just a lot of upfront planning that goes into this, but it's a really interesting, dual use strategy for solar. Next slide, please. Okay, and then the other part of sustainability is, of course, supporting communities. Others have talked today about jobs. There's hundreds of jobs, for the large utility size projects created during construction, and then several permanent jobs, offered, for the project life. As was also mentioned today, the tax revenue is, a really big deal. Millions of dollars in property tax revenue can go to local schools, fire departments, parks, and basically other, public services. I also mentioned, the revenue for landowners. This is really important. And someone said earlier, that the prime farmland or, this renewable energy is such an important component to some individuals, financial situation. And, it can contribute, for 25 or more years to the farming business, to generations of families. So, it's just renewable energy can just be, a really great opportunity. Some companies like Lightsource BP considers educational opportunities as well for our projects. And I have a couple case studies on this that I'll mention later. We like to use our projects as sort of living labs, and we're doing that with Penn State University right now for some projects in Pennsylvania. And then, the other thing is community funds. And this is something that, we do at every project that we work at. We go into a community and see what the needs are. And, maybe it's setting up a bike path. Maybe it's contributing to a new building for a school district. Maybe it's a playground. It really just depends. We do, honestly, it just really varies. It just depends on what, what needs are out there in the community. So, to the extent that developers can, make those ties and provide extra benefits to communities, it's just, it's just a really important component of development. Next slide, please. So a question that I get all the time is about solar panel safety. I think I get this from landowners, I get this from regulators, and even politicians. So, so I sort of tried to break down the situation on this slide, but the bottom line is that solar panels will not leach toxic levels of materials into the environment. There's a very strong lamination process used during the manufacturing of PV. And that strong lamination process basically captures any potential hazardous material, within the laminated glass, and it basically prevents, exposure to the environment. We work with the Solar Energy Industry Association on this topic, and we vetted a lot of material, as Lightsource BP, but also as an industry. And there's a test, some of you may have heard of it. It's called the Toxicity Characteristic Leaching Procedure, or TCLP. And basically solar panels, before they're released, had this test conducted. And so basically they break solar panels, and then they which is extremely unlikely, okay? But in the event of a breakage, this test determines if any contaminants could potentially leak into the environment at toxic levels. And this is actually part of RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, cradle to grave. But it's really important data for us as we understand, the potential for leaching toxic materials as these panels sit, on the landscape for 25, 30 years. So I think that, through this data, we can feel really confident and secure about the solar panels that are going on the landscape. Next slide, please. And then the next thing I just want to touch on is solar panel recycling. Really, really important. The industry takes this very seriously. Lightsource BP takes this very seriously. I think most people know PV panels. They're glass, aluminum, copper, silver, and semiconductor materials. They can be successfully recovered and reused. Really, like 80% of a typical PV panel is glass and aluminum. So, you know, they're common, they're easy to recycle. SIA, the trade association I just mentioned, they have a national PV recycling program. And so basically they have PV manufacturers basically take back, you know, the solar panels. But that's an issue now. I mean, we're talking about, you know, putting solar panels on the landscape for the future. And we are working together to have sort of buyback's not the word, but sort of a buyback with the manufacturers. But, you know, we're also working on legislation, right? And so, you know, we're really hopeful that legislation around solar panel recycling will be developed in a smart way. You know, California is leading the way with this, Washington State. And, you know, we just anticipate even more advanced recycling methodologies to be available, you know, in the coming years. But, you know, I did want to note this is a really big deal for the industry. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to just end it just a couple minutes here with a couple case studies. Next slide, please. So we have our Bighorn solar project in Pueblo, Colorado right now, 295 megawatts under construction. And this is a really cool setup that we've done with the Evraz Rocky Mountain Steel mill facility, and then, you know, in combination with Excel. So we have a 20-year fixed rate structure, and it provides predictable electricity prices, and it allows the steel mill, which employs about 1,000 workers, to have exactly that predictability, and is allowing it to stay in Pueblo and invest in its future. And then, of course, you know, added job security for those 1,000 workers. So, you know, we're really proud of this partnership with Evraz, Excel, and us. So, you know, the offsets about 90% of the Evraz Rocky Mountain Steel Mills annual electricity demand. You know, so that's really cool too. It's just Evraz is a great partner for Lightsource. Next slide, please. So the other thing that we're doing at the Bighorn Solar Project is partnering with a group called Grid Alternatives. And if you've never heard of them, go check out their website. I mean, just an amazing organization. And so basically, you know, what Grid Alternatives does is it goes into communities, underserved communities, and it takes individuals and brings them to solar sites and gives them the training that they need, technical training, to work in solar on the construction side, but actually other, you know, transferable skills as well. So it's a national nonprofit. It basically makes, you know, job training accessible, and the focus is on under-resourced communities and communities of color. So this is something that Lightsource has been sponsoring, you know, for quite a while, and we are looking to only expand our partnership with Grid Alternatives. We are partnering with them and our EPC contractor at Bighorn, you know, to have, you know, these opportunities for learning and training, combined with the Bighorn Solar Project. So it's just really a fabulous organization. We're really proud to partner with them, and that sort of, you know, it's part of how we manage social justice and, you know, the other sort of sustainability aspects, you know, beyond clean energy. Next slide, please. And then the next thing, case study I've just mentioned, is our Whitetail solar project in Pennsylvania. We have partnered with the American Solar Grazing Association, who we're also working with on our Bighorn project. And this project in Pennsylvania is actually our first sheep grazing project. American Solar Grazing Association, in partnership with Ernst Seeds, has created this mix called fuzz and buzz, meaning that the buzz means it's suitable for pollinators and the fuzz means it's suitable for grazing. And it's just created this beautiful landscape, across our site in Pennsylvania. And we're going to begin sheep grazing there in 2021. And we're looking to to use this experience and apply it elsewhere. For our Bighorn project, which is still under construction, we're working out our biodiversity plan there, but of course it's in shortgrass prairie country. And so we're working on a shortgrass prairie conservation plan, implementing pollinators as well, and also looking at, grazing opportunities there. Next slide, please. I think that's the end. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate the time.
Thank you, Alyssa. And thanks to Mike, Greg, Troy, and Kathy. We appreciate you sharing some of your great information and personal stories to better help tell the renewable energy narrative of Colorado. We are getting close to the time, but we do have a couple minutes, and I'd like to try to squeeze in a couple questions that we had both in the chat and the Q&A. If we don't get to your question, we will personally email you back with a good solid answer for you. One of the benefits of Zoom webinars these days. So Greg, the first question is actually for you. If you could turn on your screen, Greg. But it's, have you seen an evolution of support for wind projects in Eastern Colorado? Specifically, as an example, in terms of counties or residents maybe who were against it, they were unsure, but now maybe they embrace it and look to attract it.
Yes, is the short answer, but it's even more complicated than that. There are still counties where there's opposition to organized opposition to the development of wind farms. And so you can't take anything for granted. I think it's something that advocates have to continually work to let people know what these benefits are, so that it's not forgotten and they're not taken for granted.
Perfect, thank you. And that is important, because we always have to keep our eye on what's important and try to help educate people in terms of the benefits and recognize that people have concerns and we want to address those concerns. So thank you. Alyssa, quick question for you, and this actually came from Greg, but what's the minimum acreage needed to interest a solar developer when you're looking at potential project sites?
For utility scale solar, I mean, it depends on a lot of things. To get a fully economically viable site in, I mean, at 1,000 acres, I'd say about 1,000.
Very good, thank you.
Yeah.
Last very quick question, and this is a softball that I'm going to throw at Greg. He's been working in this space for a long time, but Greg, how can chambers of commerce and economic development organizations best help solar and wind projects be successful in their communities?
It is kind of a softball. It goes down to the educational effort. And remember, Colorado, we have term limits on state legislators for sure, and in many cases on county commissioners. And you know how powerful county commissioners are in Colorado. So with the turnover in the political leadership, I think it's just critically important for chambers and groups like Pro 15 and Action 22 to continually educate elected officials about the benefits and the new advancements that we see in the entire renewable energy space, because you can't take for granted that the person coming in understands the history and understands the value and benefits of these projects to the county.
Perfect, thank you. And I have to throw that softball question out. I would not be doing my job, so thanks, Greg, for fielding it. With that, it's time to wrap up. I'd like to once again say thank you to all of our presenters, and thank you for all of you who attended today's webinar. Appreciate all of those that signed on as co-hosts to help us promote this event in Colorado. You will be able to view the webinar on our website soon. We'll be sure to send you a follow-up email that has a link, so you can do that and or forward on to anyone else that you may feel could gain some good insight from the information that has been shared today. So with that, we look forward to working with you in the future to continue to develop renewable energy economy in Colorado. And I hope you have a great day, a great remainder of the holiday season, and hopefully a much better